In this episode, I'm going to talk about one of the most significant parts of child development. It receives a little attention, actually, sometimes scientifically and sometimes by parents and children because it's so natural. Seems like you just feed kids and put clothes on them and they grow, they change physically. But as it turns out, developmentally speaking, physical development is an essential part of child development and often the foundation of every other form of development. For example, if a child is ill, then physical development slows, and so does every other form of development. And so we learn from that the growth of the brain and the body is central to other things which happen in a child's life. And equally important is that there are a lot of wonderful things that parents can do to make sure that the children have a great experience. So here are 2 or 3 outcomes that are important. By the time a child is 12, it is very important for them to have a healthy and positive body image. It doesn't matter that they're tall or short or whatever, as long as their image is positive and they like how they look and how they feel about it. It's also important that they've attached gender role behavior to their body, so they're comfortable moving and looking like a female or a male. And sometimes when children are not in that position, then they have questions about that, which often end up being what is called gender dysphoria. And gender dysphoria is confusion about my gender. And sometimes it is easily resolved, and sometimes it's very complicated, makes life for a child difficult because alternate forms of identity tend to be accompanied by other forms of serious problems. So first of all, let's talk about body growth. Body growth is a different rate for every child, as you know, if you have more than one child. And so sometimes they grow fast, sometimes slow, sometimes there will be a surge of growth. And you could discover that almost always it follows this pattern. Vertical growth precedes horizontal growth. That is, if I'm a boy, I'll grow inches tall before my chest muscles begin to thicken, and so on. And there's actually things you can look at and watch to make sure that kids are receiving the kind of support they need. You should become acquainted with what a late developing person, like a girl, for example, is tall and willowy and won't get her full development, and you might have an early developing girl or a boy, and they are more advanced in terms of their physical movement. They sometimes are more popular and so on, but early developing kids, girls in particular, suffer more social ridicule than late developing girls. And they do that because their bodies are more mature than their mental capacity is often to handle it. And especially their social relationships, they simply don't know how to handle it. Like a 7th or 8th grade boy, for example, doesn't know what to do with a girl who has a fully mature body. Well, at least they didn't used to know what to do with that, but a 9th grade boy would understand what that means. So you pay attention to body growth, and that means that you have to pay attention to nutrition and a lot of health practices so that the kids are healthy along the way. Well, what are good guidelines? Well, 3 meals a day, actually, and snacks in between would be good. And also watching the speed of development. So if there's any form of development which lags or slows down for any length of time, you be concerned about that. Well, what are the health issues that are involved? Well, they're dietary issues, they're illnesses that you're watching for. What are the most common? Colds and flus, of course. And then nowadays we're experiencing a lot of other kinds, like forms of cancer. More of those are appearing for some reason than used to be the case. So we need to be better educated about the types of illnesses and so on. In America today, one of the primary concerns is obesity. And sometimes parents will say, here, eat this to solve emotional problems, or let kids eat anytime, any way they want to, or any food that they want to. and then discover later on that their children have difficulty with being obese. And I will tell you that kids who are obese suffer a great deal, not only physically because their movements are restricted often, but socially especially. And kids are not real forgiving or accepted quite often. So girls who are large and boys who are large, you know, you have to do something additional to help them feel successful and so on. What about health education? You want all of this. You want to teach them about the sex and reproduction. You want to teach them about how their bodies function and why. And you say, well, why do that? Well, teach them about muscles and about the nervous system and about how brains work, and teach them so that they understand at least a little bit about how to care for themselves, so that they can learn to manage their own life and to be successful physically. Now, I'd like to double down on that just for a minute and say, well, what if you say, I'm busy, I don't have time to do that? Well, here's the question. Either take the time to do that, or you'll take time solving problems, physical problems. So we want them to have good health practices. And today, there's an amazing amount of resources about diets and about exercise and so on. So that brings me, see, to what child development scientists call motor development, and about play and about physical activity. And we just simply need in our society now more opportunities for kids to be involved in a greater variety of play. So we want them to develop physical skills because, well, why? Because mental development and emotional development are related to it. The better and more healthy the growth, the better other forms of development. So when they're healthy, we get more information processing growth and so on. So what happens? Develop what are called fine motor skills. These are use of fingers to write, to draw, to pick up, and so on, and give them games. See, to develop these fine motor skills. We also want gross or larger motor performance, running, jumping, sports, and etc. We often neglect the fine motor skills training, and you can enhance this by practice. And so it's one of those rare forms of development that parents can be successful at promoting the development and then watching the results, because kids can learn to improve how they draw, how they move, and so on. Well, what about parental role in physical development? Well, make sure you teach children about their bodies. Make sure that you are the ones that teach about sex and reproduction. If you're thinking that a good time to do that would be 9 or 10 years of age, you're probably a year or two late, because sexual information is widely available to kids, and they talk about it more openly, kids do, than they used to. And so you either allow kids to pool their ignorance and talk about some form of sex or some form of reproduction that's not accurate, or you give them accurate information, you reduce their curiosity about it, and it helps them be stable and better off. We want them to be girls that feel good about being feminine and the movements and so on. We also want them to be free so that they're not restricted, because nowadays the categories for femininity are quite broad, and masculinity as well, for which I'm personally grateful for, so that kids can feel good about themselves, how they look, how they move, how they function, and so on. Now, what about kids who are not coordinated, or their coordination comes later? Make sure they have a variety of options to their physical development, so they get involved in many different kinds of activities, so that they don't depend on just that one. Because if they depend on that one and they're not good at the basketball tournaments or so on, then they suffer more. Physical development, in closing, is something that we parents can promote and be successful at. I hope you do, and I hope you have very successful children who are happy and have very high positive images of their own bodies.